The number I represents square root of -1. So I is a variable, that means square root of -1. And it means that I squared gives us -1. So when there's a negative number under the radical, we can pull out I and write it in front of the radical. So number 1 wants me to find the square root of 25. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break it up into two pieces. I'm going to have the square root of 25 and the square root of -1 because I can take apart the pieces that multiply. Remember, the square root of 25 is 5. And I told you up above that the square root of square root of -1 is I. I can do the same thing with square root of -72. I can split it up into 2. 72 is not a perfect square, so I want to do the factor tree. I have 2 and 36, 2 and 18, 2 and 9, and 3 and 3. So I have a pair of 3's and a pair of 2's. 2 times 3 is 6. That goes outside. I'm also going to turn this into I, which also goes outside. And I have a leftover 2 that stays inside that radical. Why did my computer not print? That's weird. This is a 9. So I want to split this up. So I have -5 times the square root of 9 times the square root of -1. So I have -5. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of -1 is I. So I still want to keep multiplying those three pieces together. I am going to multiply -5 by 3, which gives me -15, and that I stays at the end. We can also find zeros of equations now where the square root of is a negative number. So up until this point, you've been telling me no solution. When it says to find the zeros of f of x equals 4x squared plus 20, what I want to do here is I want to set equal to 0 first instead of the f of x. So instead of having that f of x, I'm going to have 0. And then I just write the right side of the equation as I have it. I'm going to subtract 20 on both sides to get that x squared alone, because this method looks like it would be best solved using square roots. I keep wanting to get that x squared alone, so I'm going to divide both sides by 4. My answer is 5. I was thinking ahead. So I get -5 equals x squared. I want to get rid of that squared symbol, so the opposite of squared is square root. I have x equals plus or minus, because remember I took that square root of -5. I want to split this into two things, so I want to have plus or minus square root of 5 times the square root of -1. I can't do anything with the square root of 5, but I can turn the square root of -1 into an I, and that goes in front of the radical. Okay. Complex numbers can be written in the form a plus bi. So this is important to remember. You always want to write the real part first and the imaginary part second. And a and b are real numbers. So we can find the values of x and y in an equality of two complex numbers by setting the corresponding components equal to each other and solving. So basically that's what a lot of words to say I want to take the two real parts, which I have right there, the 2x and 10, and I want to set those equal together. And I would solve them like normal. I would divide by 2. I get x equals 5. So I've solved by looking at my real parts, and then I want to take my imaginary parts and take those and set those equal to each other. So I have -7i equals yi. So on here, to get y alone, I want to divide both sides by I. I get, I get -7i equals y. I want to do the same thing for the next equation. So I'm going to take my two real parts, the x and the 9, and I'm going to set those equal to each other. So I have x equals 9, nothing to solve, so that is my answer. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the other part. I have the 3i equals negative yi. So on this one, it has a negative and an I that both need to be divided by out. Both need to be divided out. So I get 3 equals negative 3 equals y. Because when I divide by the negative, it changes the sign there. Okay. So I can also add and subtract complex numbers, and it's similar to when I'm combining like terms. The that is weird. It should say, this should be a lowercase I. So only numbers that have an I term in them can be added together. So 7 through 9 want me to add or subtract and then write my answer in standard form. When I have a plus sign in between, I just read it like normal. So I'm going to combine my real numbers together. I have 8 and 5 that need to be added. That gets me 13. Then I want to take my two imaginary parts. I have negative I and 4i. So this has a secret 1 out front. I really have negative 1 plus 4, which gives me positive 3i. And that is my answer on this question. Okay, so on number 8, I have this negative in between. What I want to do is I want to first distribute this. So I am going to write out the part I started with. So I have 7 minus 6i. And then I'm going to go ahead and distribute. So I have negative times 3, which gives me negative 3. Negative times negative 6i, which gives me positive 6i. Now I can go ahead and combine my like terms. So I have 7 and negative 3, which gives me 4. Then I have negative 6i plus 6i, which ends up canceling out. So I don't have to have an imaginary term. I can just have a number. And the opposite is also true. I can just have an imaginary number. I don't have to have a real number. Okay. On 9, it is doing a bunch of stuff. So I have 13, that stays where it is. I have this negative that I want to distribute. So negative times 2 gives me negative 2. And negative times 7i gives me negative 7i. And that 5i at the end is just going to stay there for now. Then I want to go ahead and combine my like terms. I have positive 13, negative 2. That gives me 11. Then I have negative 7i, positive 5i. That gives me negative 2i. Okay. Multiplying complex numbers is kind of similar to how we multiply polynomials. If I just have a number out front, I want to start by just distributing that. So I have 4 times negative 6, which gives me negative 24. 4 times I, which just gives me 4i. There is nothing to simplify here, so I am going to leave that alone. Okay. On this one, I have two binomials that I'm multiplying together. What I want to do here is I want to FOIL. Remember, that is doing the first terms together, then the outer terms, the inner, and then the last terms get multiplied together. So I'm going to do those in these colors. So my first terms are 9 and negative 4. Gets me negative 36. My outer terms are 9 and 7i, which gets me 63i. Then I have negative 2i times negative 4, which gets me positive 8i. And I have negative 2i times positive 7i, which gives me negative 14i squared. So I can go ahead and I can combine like terms like I normally would. So right now all I have is the 63i and the 8i. Everything else is going to stay where they are. I have negative 36, and then 63 plus 8 is 71. That I looks really weird. I'm going to white it out and fix it. And then I'm going to write that negative 14i squared. Remember on the front side of this, I said I squared equals negative 1. I always want to replace it with that because standard form only has real numbers and I to the first power. So I am going to write myself a note right here that I squared equals negative 1. So what I want to do is I want to replace the I squared right there with negative 1. Okay. Then I want to multiply that negative 14 by that negative 1, which gives me a positive 14. And now I can combine that back with the negative 36 at the front. So that'll give me negative 22, and that 71i just stays at the end. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is I want you to take a few minutes, first pause the video, then take a few minutes and solve the practice problems. Once you have done that, you can hit play, and I will work through the practice problems so you can check your work. First, I need to figure out what number didn't print. 12. Okay. So I will go ahead and solve these. So the first one wants me to take the square root of negative 81. I want to first split this up by the square root of 81 and the square root of negative 1. Square root of 81 is 9. Square root of negative 1 is I. So my answer there is just 9i. On 13, I want to split this up to 56 and the square root of negative 1. I want to do my factor tree for 56. I get 2 and 28, 2 and 14, 2 and 7. I have a pair of 2's, so that will go outside. The negative 1, square root of negative 1 will turn into I, and then these two leftover numbers get multiplied together, so I have 2 times 7, which turns into 14, and stays inside that square root. Okay. On 14, I want to rewrite this as negative 7 times the square root of 12 times the square root of negative 1. That negative 7 is going to stay out front, and I need to factor tree my 12. So I have 12 over here, I have 2 and 6, and 2 and 3. So the 2 can come out. That 3 is going to stay in the square root. Then I have to take care of the square root of negative 1, which turns into just I. I'm going to multiply these two numbers together. So I have negative 7 times 2, which gives me negative 14. I want to take that I and move it in front of the radical, and then I have square root of 3. Okay. Number 15 is asking that I find all of the zeros of f of x equals 7x squared plus 70. This I want to start by setting equal to 0. Then I want to get x squared all by itself, so I'm going to subtract 70 on both sides. I have negative 70 equals 7x squared. I want to divide both sides by 7. I get 10 equals negative 10 equals x squared. Then I want to take the square root. I have the square root of negative plus or minus the square root of negative 10 equals x. I cannot factor tree 10 because if I do it, it's just 2 and 5. So it stays where it is. So this is my final answer. Okay. This one wants me to solve for x and y. What I want to do is I want to take my two real pieces. So that's 5x and 35. I want to take those and set those equal to each other. I have 5x equals 35. Divide both sides by 5. I get x equals 7. I want to do the same thing for the imaginary parts. So I'm going to take the negative 20i and the yi and set those equal to each other. I have negative 20i equals yi. Divide both sides by I. I get negative 20 equals y. Same thing on 17. So I have 9 and negative 2x are both my real numbers. So I have 9 equals negative 2x. I want to divide both sides by negative 2. I will divide this one out because it turns out nicely. I get negative 4.5 equals x for my real number. And then I want to do the same thing for my imaginary parts. I have 4yi equals 3i. I want to get that y alone, so I'm going to divide both sides by 4i, which gets me y equals, the i's cancel out. I have 3/4. I can turn that into a nice decimal as well. That is going to give me 0.75. Either the 3/4 or the 0.75 would be fine. Okay. Number 18 wants me to add or subtract. 18 is adding, so I'm combining like terms. I don't have to worry about distributing. 2 plus 11 gets me 13. Then I want to combine my imaginary parts. I have 9i minus 1i, which has a secret 1, which gets me 8i. On 19, I have this negative sign in between, so I want to go ahead and distribute. That's going to give me a negative 8 and a negative 4i. The first set of parentheses stayed the same, so I want to write that out front. Then I want to go back and combine my like terms. I have 13 minus 8, which gives me 5. Then I have 4i minus 4i, which again cancels out. So my answer here is just 5. If I take a look at 20, I have that 16. Then I want to go ahead and distribute that negative. So I have negative 13, negative 6i. And that 8i at the end just stays there. I want to combine my real parts. I have 16 minus 13, which gives me 3. Then I have negative 6i plus 8i, which gives me positive 2i. Okay. On 21, I want to multiply and distribute. So I have 15i times negative 1, which gives me negative 15i. Then I have 15i times 2i, which is going to give me 30i squared. Remember from when I was solving that I squared needs to be replaced with negative 1 every time I see it. So I've gone ahead and replaced that with negative 1. I want to multiply 30 by negative 1, which gives me negative 30. To write this in standard form, you always have your real piece in front. So I have negative 30 minus 15i. On 22, I want to go ahead and FOIL. I have 4 times 11, which gives me 44. Then I have 4 times 8i, which gives me 32i. Then I want to do negative 12i times 11, which gives me negative 132i. And then I want to take that negative 12i and multiply by a positive 8i, which gives me negative 96i squared. I want to go ahead and combine my terms in the middle. So I have 44 minus 100i minus 96i squared. I want to replace the I squared with negative 1. So that's going to give me 44 minus 100i. Negative 96 times negative 1 gives me positive 96. Then I want to go ahead and combine my real pieces. So I have 44 and 96, which gives me 140 minus 100i.